A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, the War Dance. By Naki. A new episode every single day. Episode 21-3. Price of a Prince Part 3. The morning of the departure for Pella dawned in a bruised violet haze, the kind of light that seemed to hold its breath. Where the night before had been a city of silk and fire, there was now only the rhythmic metallic clatter of disassembly. The heavy thud of cedar tent poles being wrenched from the earth, the rustle of coarse, dyed wool bundles being lashed to carts, and the low, restless snicker of war horses waiting for the bridle. The army was stirring, but it was a sleepy movement. The slow, rhythmic clanking of camp followers packing gear, and the muffled, mechanical commands of the phalanx officers. It was a deceptive calm. The men moved with the guarded precision of predators who knew they were being watched. There was no guarantee that the forest edge or the ridgeline wouldn't erupt with arrows the moment the last column turned its back. Every man, from the high-born cavalryman to the lowest spear carrier, kept one eye on the ridgeline and the other on the horizon. The royal pavilion, the final structure to be dismantled, stood hollowed out against the morning sky as Perdiccas, Eurydice, and Euryno emerged into the chill. They were flanked by the Theban vanguard, whose polished shields caught the pale, early light and flung it back like mirrors of cold, unyielding iron. Perdiccas moved with a forced, measured gait, his hand anchored to the pommel of his sword, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Every gaze from the rank and file is an assessment, a silent, lethal tally of my weaknesses. They are waiting for me to falter, to look like a king who inherited a hollow title, rather than one who carved it from the bone of the state. If I show even a flicker of the terror I feel, the Regency dies in this mud. The road to Pella has never felt this long, Perdiccas said, his voice level despite the dry constriction in his throat. We must ensure the phalanx remains in tight formation until we clear the river valley. Eurydice stood to his right, her expression a masterclass in regal indifference. My son speaks of formations while the barons are already drafting the treaties of our downfall. He plays the king with such tragic earnestness. Yet he has not learned that a crown is never won in the comfort of a throne room. It is held by the throat in the dark. I must make him harder, or he will be buried before the first harvest of his reign. Formation is for parades, Perdiccas, she murmured, her voice carrying the cold, sharp sting of iron. On this road, you are not a king. You are a prize to be hunted. Keep your eyes on the shields, but your mind on the shadows. Euryno trailed slightly behind them, her hands clasped so tightly beneath her shawl that her knuckles were bone white. Mother and brother are locked in a game of power, oblivious to the fact that the wolves are already at the door, sniffing for blood. I can feel the eyes of the spies in the camp. It is as if I can hear the scratching of their quills recording our weaknesses for the history books. I only wish I possessed even a fraction of Philip's terrifying certainty. Is there truly no other way to reach the city? Euryno asked, her voice a fragile reed against the rising wind. Must we walk directly into the jaws of those who wish to see us fail? Philip was already mounted, sitting atop a powerful black maned stallion that paced with nervous electric energy. He was not dressed for a coronation but for the slaughter. His armor, still stained with the dried grime and blood of the funeral games, caught the dawnlight in jagged, dull flashes. He was the only one in the retinue who seemed to welcome the looming threat of an ambush. His posture was coiled, waiting for the first snap of a twig to shatter the morning's suffocating tension. They speak of this road as if it were a choice, debating the decor while we march through a slaughterhouse. Perdiccas wants order and Mother wants intrigue, but they fail to understand that the only language the Illyrians and the plotting barons speak is the sound of breaking bone. I will lead the vanguard, and if the Illyrians dare to descend, I will ensure the first thing they taste is the price of their insolence. The line is agonizingly slow, Philip remarked, his voice cutting through the quiet like a whetstone. If we move at this pace, we are not an army. We are a procession of sheep waiting for the wolves to wake up. When Perdiccas pressed that order is our armor, Philip laughed, a harsh, dissonant sound. Order is a corpse in a box, brother. He kicked his horse forward, not waiting for a response, his armored form pulling ahead. The path is what it is. We don't get to choose the geography. But if they want to ambush us, let them. I'm tired of waiting for the strike. Near the rear of the baggage train, Aegae moved with her 3 sons, Archelaus, Arrhidaeus, and Menelaus. They carried themselves with the brittle, guarded tension of those who had learned that in Aegae, bloodlines were death warrants. 3 sons. 3 targets in the eyes of the Regency and 3 obstacles in the eyes of the usurpers. Every mile we march toward Pella is a mile deeper into the web. Perdiccas and Philip are busy playing at war, oblivious to the fact that their survival will likely come at the cost of my children. She rested a hand on Archelaus' shoulder. "Keep your heads low," Aegae whispered, her voice a calm current beneath the clamor of the infantry. "The eyes of the court are everywhere, and today they are hungry. Do not look for glory in the vanguard. Look for the path of least resistance." Argead, the youngest, clutched a wooden toy. "Is Philip going to protect us, mother?" Aegae followed his gaze to the front of the column. She did not see a protector, she saw a storm. Philip protects only his own ambition, Argead. In this kingdom, the only protection you will ever find is the one you carve for yourselves with your own silence. We are not traveling with a royal house. We are traveling with a funeral procession that hasn't realized it is dead yet. As the column began its agonizing climb, the sound of iron-shod wheels grinding against limestone echoed like a dirge. Scattered along the line, the men who held the true gears of the kingdom moved in silence, each tethered to the other by threads of mutual suspicion. Old Attalus sat heavy in his saddle, his gaze locked on the iron-bound chest of gold. Inner thought, they believe this gold is a tether meant to bind me to their failing heartbeat. They think they are purchasing loyalty, unaware that I am the self-appointed custodian of a legacy that is currently hemorrhaging out in the dirt. If this column breaks, this gold becomes weight for the carrion birds. "Keep the wagons closed," Attalus commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp. "If we are hit, we do not fight for the coin. Coin is a poor shield. We fight for the line. Do not die for metal, die for the formation." Parmenion rode at the tip of the vanguard, his eyes tracing the ridgeline. Inner thought, I see the gaps in their formation, and I see the gaps in their minds. Perdiccas plays the king, while Philip plays at being a god of war. Neither has truly grasped the simple, brutal geometry of this pass. We are walking through a graveyard of our own making, and the earth is waiting for us to stop so it can't swallow us whole. "Adjust the pace," Parmenion commanded, his voice deadened. "The men are bunching in the narrows. We move like a spear, or we die like cattle. Tell the regent I am taking the scouts forward." Antipater paced alongside the retinue with the predatory gait of a spider. Inner thought, the structural integrity of this march is failing, and the collapse is as beautiful as it is predictable. By the time they reach the Haliacmon, this regency will be so hollowed out by fear and incompetence that whatever survives the crossing will be mine and mine alone to reshape. He slowed his pace beside Lord Dirtis, his smile not reaching his eyes. A delicate operation, is it not? One watches the seams pull and the fatigue set in, and one cannot help but wonder. Will the foundation hold the weight of this march, or is it destined to crumble? Young Attalus trailed behind his father, his hand anchored to his sword hilt. Look at him, he thought, watching his father's obsession with the gold. We are following a shadow, playing our parts in a tragedy that has already concluded. I should be writing for the high passes, carving out a life in the hills where a man's worth is measured by his strength, not by his capacity to rot alongside a dying throne. They don't even look like an army, father, the younger man muttered. They're just waiting for the first arrow to tell them it's time to run. Why are we tethering our house to a horse that is already dead? Old Attalus didn't turn. Because, boy, in a falling house, the last one to leave is the one who gets to pick the locks. Ensure you are holding the hilt, not the blade. The final remnants of the camp were swallowed by the baggage train, a sprawling, groaning beast of wood and iron that lurched onto the main road. As the column snaked away from the tomb city of Aegae, the air was not filled with the relief of departure, but with the suffocating pressure of a long, sustained holding of breath. Ismenias and the Theban vanguard stood at the heart of the formation, his spear grounded, his gaze tracing the perimeter with rhythmic, predatory precision. A kingdom in retreat is a kingdom already lost, he thought. My duty is to the balance of power, not the crown. If they demonstrate the slightest weakness, I will be the first to suggest to Thebes that we cut our losses. Keep the files tight, Ismenias commanded. If the Illyrians come, they will strike for the seams. Let them break their teeth on our bronze. The Athenian envoy reclined within his curtained litter, his disdain for the dust-choked ranks palpable. Look at them, he mused. They move like a funeral pyre on wheels. If the Illyrians cut them to ribbons, I shall be halfway to the coast before the first report reaches Pella. I need only ensure the Regency is too distracted by their own annihilation to notice I am drafting a report that effectively derecognizes their sovereign legitimacy. Slow, he muttered to his scribe. If we hear the clash of steel, we turn back immediately. I'm a diplomat, not a casualty. Lord Dirtus of Elamia rode on the periphery, his hand resting on his bridle, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. My lands are the shield wall of the north. If the brothers fall, Elamia burns first. I will play the loyalist until the first drop of blood falls. Then I shall see which way the wind blows. The path is dangerously narrow, is it not, Regent? Dirtus called out, his voice laced with honeyed concern. I fear our flank is far too exposed to the heights. Creon of Fairy watched the column with a gaze sharpened by decades of political knife work. The brothers are the bait, and the Regency is the cage. I have already sent word to Pella. If the column does not arrive by the third day, the city gates are to remain locked to the royal party. Their survival is no longer a requirement for my plans. It is a quiet morning, Creon remarked to the thin air, his tone deceptively casual. Almost too quiet for a march through the heart of Illyrian territory. Tucked into the baggage train, disguised as common laborers, 3 figures move with fluid, dangerous anonymity. The Lancestian agent watched the road, his mind dividing the spoils. Every step away from Aegae was a step deeper into a closing net. He saw the northern silver mines already falling under his master's banner, and he prayed the Illyrian blades would leave nothing for the vultures. Beside him, the agent of the tyrant kept his eyes fixed on Philip. He saw the Regency as a predictable clockwork mechanism of tradition, but he recognized the younger prince as a dangerous, serrated anomaly. If the boy died in the pass, the game was won. If he survived, the tyrant would be forced to contend with a monster that no amount of gold or diplomacy could control. They exchanged a single, wordless glance as the column began to ascend the first rise. For the soldiers in the ranks, this was a march home. For the 3 in the shadows, it was the final, measured countdown to the extinction of the Argead line. The camp sat perched on the jagged shoulder of the Birmian range, a desolate shelf of limestone and scree that overlooked the Haliacmon River as its snake coiled toward the Aegean. From this vantage point, Pausanias was less than 40 miles from Pella as the crow flies, yet the geological divide between him and the capital was absolute. While Pella sat in the center of the vast alluvial sprawl of the Macedonian plain, a city of low-lying marshes, navigable canals, and fertile, mud-rich loam, Pausanias' position was defined by verticality. The landscape here was a labyrinth of vertical limestone cliffs, dense sun-starved pine forests, and narrow, treacherous defiles that acted as the natural gateway between the rugged highlands and the lowland capital. Pausanias stood at the edge of the limestone shelf, the wind whipping his cloak. Below him, the Haliacmon cut through the valley like a vein of hammered silver, the riverbed churning against jagged rock, a geographic bottleneck that served as the kingdom's carotid artery. 38 miles of blood-soaked dust, he mused, tracing the winding, serpentine path of the road with his gaze. They are down there in the muck, surrounded by the stagnant canals and the rot of the marshes, while I am here in the clean, cold air of the mountain gods. The geological contrast was not lost on him. In the lowlands, the phalanx could deploy its strength, moving in the wide, predictable blocks that the Argeads favored. But here, in the shadow of the mountains, the ground was uneven, broken, and cruel. They rely on the symmetry of the plain, he thought, his fingers tracing the hilt of his blade. They need the level earth to keep their long spears upright. They have forgotten that the high ground dictates the rhythm of the low. He watched the tiny, crawling line of the royal column far below, a sluggish, metallic worm moving slowly through the foothills. They were tethered to the slow, heavy pace of their baggage trains and the suffocating pride of their military formation. Let them descend into the marshes of Pella, he whispered to the biting mountain air. The deeper they sink into their own capital, the further they are from the mountain iron. By the time they realize their discipline is useless in the broken terrain of the river crossings, I will have already seized the high ground of their history. The dawnlight hit the Birmian peaks like a blunt hammer, shattering the shadows and revealing the winding, sluggish coil of the Macedonian column far below. The royal army was breaking camp. the sound of heavy iron moving against stone drifting up to the Illyrian ridge like a low, mournful chant. Bartolus stood at the edge of the limestone shelf, his scarred hand resting on the pommel of his war spear. Beside him, the camp was alive with the smell of wood smoke and the impatient stamping of Illyrian stallions. "They are leaving," Bartolus rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Back to Pella." Cletus stepped up to his father's side, his knuckles white as he gripped his own spear. The young warrior's eyes were narrow, fixed with hunger on the glint of bronze moving through the distant valley. "Father, we have the high ground. The slope is in our favor. Why do we let them crawl away? We should strike now, shatter their baggage train, or at the very least harass them until they are paralyzed by their own fear." A younger voice, sharp and biting, cut in from the periphery. "We just watch them? We sit here like old men counting sheep, while the crown of Macedon passes beneath our boots." Bartolus didn't turn. He watched the movement of the phalanx, a slow, disciplined rhythm that smelled of order and arrogance. Off to the side, Odata sat on a flat boulder, her fingers calloused and steady as she drew her bowstring back. The tension was nearly silent. She wasn't looking at the army, she was looking at the horizon, her thumb tracing the notch of an arrow, her eyes already calculating the windage, and the drop of a shot fired from a mile away. Bartolus finally turned, his gaze drifting from his son to his granddaughter. His expression was unreadable, a map of old battles and forgotten mercies. "Seems like you all want more action," he said, a slow, dark mirth creeping into his voice. Cletus stepped forward, his chest heaving with frustrated adrenaline. "Show them who we are, father. Show them that these hills do not belong to the Argeads, but to the tribes who were here before they ever learned to march in rows." Bartolus let out a cynical, rasping smile. He didn't look at his son, however. He looked at Odata. The girl was still playing with her string, a faint, predatory smirk dancing on her lips. "Odata," Bartolus called out, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. "You look restless. Are you seeking adventure, or just a target to calm your blood? Tell me, how confident are you in that string of yours? From this distance, the wind is a fickle god." Odata stood up, the bow held perfectly vertical, her silhouette sharp against the morning sky. She didn't blink. "Grandfather, you know the string is my shadow. I don't miss, and I don't ask for mercy. Give me a mark, and I will carve it out of the air." Bartolus's eyes flickered with a sudden, sharp intensity. He looked back at the valley, where the Macedonian column was beginning to stretch into the narrow neck of the pass. The moment of lethargy was gone. He was a wolf again, sensing the weakness of the herd. He turned to his son, his voice snapping like a whip. "Cletus, gather the cavalry. Not for slaughter, not yet. We ride to break their rhythm. We will hover on the ridgelines, shadows at their flanks, and scream until they can hear nothing but their own heartbeat. We will scare them away from our land until they are terrified to sleep." He looked at the distant, glittering line of the Macedonian phalanx, and added, "If they want to march like masters, we will remind them that even masters bleed when they are stalked." The dust of Aegae's arena was left behind, but the scent of blood and burnt offerings seemed to cling to the royal entourage all the way back to the capital. The march back to Pella was not a triumphal procession. It was a silent, suffocating retreat. The ancient tombs of the ancestors faded into the southern mist, and before them lay the sprawling, marsh-girdled seat of Macedonian power, a city currently drowning in debt, surrounded by hostile borders, and now split down the absolute center by a single impossible victory. The dynamic of the court had fractured on the road. The carriage of the Queen Mother Eurydice and the young King Perdiccas rode in a state of funeral silence, flanked by guards whose loyalties felt increasingly conditional. The iron rims of the wheels ground heavily against the ruts of the road. Inside, Ptolemy of Eloros sat in pitch darkness, the heavy wool curtains drawn shut against the blinding afternoon sun. Opposite him sat Antipater, a wooden writing desk balanced precariously across his knees, his reed pen scratching rhythmically despite the violent jolts of the carriage. "The treasury accounts from the Pella archives arrived while we were at the pyre," Antipater murmured, not looking up from his parchment. "We have enough silver to pay the Thracian mercenaries for another 3 weeks. If the Illyrians cross the passes before the autumn harvest, we will be forced to debase the coinage again. The Athenian grain ships are already refusing our credit at Methone." Ptolemy didn't answer immediately. He stared at his own hands resting on his knees. They were steady, but the skin felt cold. "I did not ask for a ledger, Antipater," Ptolemy said, his voice a low, hollow vibration. "I asked how the phalanx looked when the boy entered the gates of Pella." Antipater paused, the tip of his reed hovering a fraction of an inch above the ink. "They didn't cheer," he said clinically. But they didn't have to. They parted for him. Every veteran from the permanent garrison shifted their spears to their left hands as his horse passed. In the old dialect, it is the silent salute to a commander who has tasted blood. They see the old king in him. Ptolemy leaned back into the shadows, his chest rising and falling in a ragged breath. "I am not a usurper," he told himself fiercely in the dark, a familiar, bitter defense mechanism, clawing through his panic. "I'm the skin holding the water inside the skin. If I drop the reins, Athens takes the ports, Thebes takes the south, and Bartolus burns the timberlands to ash. I did what I had to do with Logos to keep the boy from becoming a rallying cry for an army we cannot afford to pay. He's a variable we did not budget for," Antipater continued, his voice completely unburdened by fear or awe. "A living prince can be married off to secure the Elymiate border, or he can be sent to Thebes as a hostage to satisfy Ismenias. A dead prince is simple. But a prince who dismantles the state's executioner in front of the foreign ambassadors, he becomes a policy. We must decide if we are going to write him into the state's survival or strike him out completely." The column was a sprawling, agonizing grind of iron and fatigue, miles away from the sanctuary of the capital. High lords had long since retreated to the safety of the palace in Pella to count their coin and prepare their poisons. But out here, in the dust of the mountain pass, the atmosphere was far more volatile. Menes of Larissa stood near the line of water barrels tethered to the baggage train, watching the stable boys frantically wash the exhaustion lather from the horses. Beside him, Philinna sat on a crate turned on its side, her hands tightly woven into the fringe of her travel cloak as she listened to the rhythmic groaning of the wagons. The air here didn't smell of palace incense. It smelled of wet horsehide, iron filings, and the sour, metallic tang of an army that had been marching too long, the true, bitter scent of a Macedon at war with itself. "The court is quiet back home, I imagine," Philinna whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of the nearby wheels. She looked toward the southern horizon, toward the distant, unseen limestone walls of the royal apartments that were still days of hard trekking away. "It feels like the entire city is holding its breath for our arrival." "They are," Menes said, a grim, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his weathered mouth. He picked up a piece of dry straw from the dust and bit down on it, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the long, snaking line of the march. "The regent is up there right now, plodding and sweating, trying to figure out how to turn a lion back into a cub before we finally reach those gates. But he's a fool." He spat the straw into the dirt, his gaze hardening. You can't put the teeth back in the gums once they've already bitten through the bone. A group of veteran infantrymen passed them, their heavy bronze greaves clanking in unison. One of them, a scarred decurion who had fought under Amyntas, stopped by the trough to splash water over his face. He looked at Menes, noted the Thessalian cloak, and spat into the mud. The boy didn't blink, the soldier rumbled, wiping his beard with the back of a calloused hand. "I was there when the old king took the Illyrian charge at the passes. He had that same look. Like he was measuring the length of the ditch he was about to throw the bodies into. Ptolemy thinks he runs this house because he has the keys to the cellar. He forgets that the house belongs to the man who can hold the door." The soldier nodded once, a short, sharp gesture of raw military respect, and marched on toward the armory. Menes turned back to Philinna, his eyes gleaming in the gathering dusk. "You see that girl? That's the spark. Ptolemy can manipulate the grain prices and Antipater can draft his little laws. But the spears belong to whoever makes them feel like men instead of mercenaries. Philip didn't just win his life today. He bought himself an army. The column never reached the gates of Pella. Instead, the dream of the capital dissolved into the treacherous mountain passes that clawed at the lungs of the army. Deep within the command carriage, a heavy, timber-framed vessel draped in dark, heavy curtains, Philip sat alone, sequestered in a stifling, jolting world of his own. The memory of palace luxury felt like a fever dream from a previous life. Here, the air was stagnant, thick with the scent of dry earth, horse sweat, and the damp, cloying rot of the marshes they were slowly approaching. A single bronze lamp, suspended from a thick iron hook to counter the violent lurches of the rutted road, flickered rhythmically. It cast long, distorted shadows that danced and twisted across the cramped, swaying walls of the wagon. Philip had dismissed the court servants hours ago. He wanted no soft hands tending to him. His skin was still scrubbed raw from the coarse, abrasive lye used to scour the arena's filth from his flesh. His ribs were bound tight in strips of stiff, sweat-stained linen, and with every shuddering impact of the wooden wheels against the stone, a sharp, biting reminder of Logos's crushing weight flared in his chest. He did not move, but his eyes, fixed on the swaying lamp, remained sharp. He was not resting. He was waiting for the mountain to decide their fate. The heavy leather curtain at the rear of the wagon creaked open. Philip didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The sharp, metallic clatter of heavy equipment told him exactly who had entered. Young Attalus stepped into the wagon, his general's cloak trailing in the dust, kicked up by the column. The arrogant, thuggish grin from the arena was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, coiled hostility that radiated from him like heat from an oven. He didn't look like a courtier now. He looked like a soldier who had realized he was sharing a cage with a rival predator. "You have a loud mouth for a boy who almost died in the dirt," Attalus said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous friction as the wagon groaned over a stone. He stopped 3 paces from Philip, his hand instinctively resting on the pommel of his sword. "You think because the crowd cheered your little trick that you are safe before we reach Pella? The Regent has 5,000 mercenaries positioned at the mountain passes ahead. One word from him and your royal blood will be spilled into a roadside ditch where no one will ever find it." Philip turned slowly. In the rhythmic, dying pulse of the lamp, his slate-gray eyes were completely hollowed out, devoid of youth, devoid of anger, reflecting only the cold, geometric clarity that had saved him in the sand. "The Regent didn't send you here to threaten me, Attalus," Philip said, his voice a low, quiet hum that didn't shake, despite the agonizing movement of the wagon. "He sent you here because he's paralyzed by his own indecision. He's afraid that if he kills me now, while I'm still visible to the army, the phalanx will mutiny before we even reach the valley. And he sent you because you are afraid." Philip took a single, controlled step forward, his small frame rigid under the linen bandages. "You called me a rabbit," Philip murmured, his gaze locking onto the young general's eyes, not with rage, but with the hollow, absolute clarity of a man who had already walked through his own grave and found it empty. "But a rabbit knows how to survive the winter, Attalus. You? You are just a hound. You bite when signaled and sleep where you are tethered. Tell Ptolemy that I am not hunting for his crown, I am hunting the borders. And if he cannot hold them against the Illyrians, the army will find someone who can." Attalus's jaw locked. His fingers convulsed around his sword hilt, the leather groaning under a grip of pure, suppressed violence. In the cramped, stifling interior of the wagon, the silence became a physical weight, broken only by the rhythmic, taunting clack, clack, clack of the wooden axle, a sound like a hammer falling against an anvil. Without a word, Attalus pivoted and stormed out. Philip didn't watch him go. He pressed his forehead against the cold, vibrating wood of the wagon, his breath hitching. Beyond the shutter, the world was shifting. The fog-shrouded marshes of the Lydia's river crept closer, and beneath the trudge of 10,000 boots, the foundations of the kingdom were trembling. It wasn't a scream that broke the tension, but a low, subterranean rumble that rose from the very bones of the ridgeline. High above the narrow pass, the limestone horizon suddenly darkened. A jagged crown of iron cresting the ridge, hundreds of Illyrian riders silhouetted against the morning sun. They didn't descend. They simply appeared, a predatory monolith tracking the columns' every heartbeat from the high, broken ground. "Shields up!" The centurions shrieked, their voices cracking. "Wall! Form the wall!" The phalanx stuttered, the steady, rhythmic tramp of the march dissolving into a panicked, defensive crawl. The Illyrians broke into a gallop, riding parallel to the Macedonians along the slopes. They were not attacking, they were herding. Cletus, the vanguard of the riders, spurred his stallion to a peak directly above Philip. He pulled the beast into a rearing halt, his silhouette a dark god against the sky. He didn't throw his spear. He simply tapped the shaft against his shield, a hollow, mocking thud that echoed down into the pass. "Cattle," the sound seemed to jeer. "You are cattle in a chute." At the head of the marauders, Audita wove through the mountain scrub with the terrifying fluidity of a predator. She pulled her mount alongside Bartolus, her face flushed with the electric thrill of the hunt. "Grandfather," she shouted over the thunder of hooves. "Do you want to see them tremble?" Bartolus watched her, his eyes narrowed, the fire in her eyes reflecting the same ancient, savage ambition that had once built the Argead legacy. "I know your skill, girl, but keep your bloodlust on a leash. Do not kill, not yet. We haunt them. Harass the escort, rattle the Regency, and watch the last son. Philip. He is the one who senses the blade." "As you command." Aegae drifted from the main unit like smoke. She descended the scree at a reckless sliding sprint, cutting across the face of the slope until she was mere paces from the column. The guards jerked their spears toward her, but they were paralyzed by the sheer insolence of her approach. She stood in her stirrups, her voice ringing out, sharp and imperious. "I am Aegae, granddaughter of Bartolus. Do not return to our lands if you wish to see another sunrise." Philip hauled his stallion around, his gaze locking onto hers, a collision of two cold, calculating stares. Aegae didn't blink. In one seamless, viper-fast motion, she drew her bow. She didn't aim for a man, she aimed for the gold. The string sang a sharp, singular note. The arrow hissed through the air, embedding itself in the royal baggage wagon with a violent thwack, vibrating inches from a guard's trembling hand. The column jolted to a dead halt. Aegae spun her horse, dancing on the edge of the descent, and fixed Philip with a smile that was not a challenge, but a promise. Then she vanished into the pines. "Ride!" Bartolus bellowed. They didn't just move, they erupted. The entire Illyrian clan descended the slope, a thunderous, rolling barge that seemed to pull the gravity of the mountains down with them. The sound was immense, a sustained, rhythmic roar of hooves that boomed across the valley. To the Macedonians below, it felt as though the earth itself was collapsing. The vibration rattled their shields, shook their teeth, and drowned the frantic orders of their officers. The thunder of the Illyrian charge became a singular, deafening roar, a tidal wave of horseflesh and fury that drove the Macedonian column off the open road and into the throat of the gorge. Dust blinded the phalanx, turning the day into a suffocating, choked twilight where neither rank nor file could hold. Amidst the chaos of screaming horses and the rhythmic clack of shields colliding, Philip felt the world narrow down to a single point of focus. The riders surged past, a blurred wall of leather and iron, but through the swirling grit, he saw her. Aegae. She sat her stallion with the effortless poise of a rider born of the crags, her eyes fixed on him with a piercing, predatory intensity. As the momentum of the charge swept her parallel to his position, she didn't strike. Instead, she leaned into the wind of the mountains, her dark hair lashing against her face. She tracked him, not as a target to be killed, but as a force to be recognized. As their eyes locked, the frantic clamor of the battle seemed to mute, leaving only the sharp electric hum of an unspoken tension. Aegae's lips curled into a smile, not the mocking smirk she had shown the baggage train, but something deeper, sharper, and dangerously knowing. It was a recognition that bypassed the enmity of their warring houses, a silent acknowledgement of a jagged, inevitable gravity. In that heartbeat, the war-torn gorge felt irrelevant. Philip saw more than a warrior princess, our daughter of his enemy. He saw the future. He saw the cold, sharp truth of their bloodlines colliding. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same hunger he carried in his own marrow. This was not just an ambush, it was a collision of destinies. The gold, the Regency, and the political games of Pella suddenly felt like dust in the wind. The mountains were stripping away the mask of the prince, revealing the king beneath and the woman who would stand at his side to command the fire. She was the gale that would break the Argead winter. As she pulled her mount away, vanishing back into the shadows of the gorge, Philip felt the weight of it. The crown that waited for him would not be polished, but forged. And in the dark, silent chambers of his mind, he knew the warrior princess who had just threatened his life would one day be the one to share his throne. She would be the first to break him and the first to bind his kingdom together as his queen. To be continued in episode 22, Iphicrit's Gardener of Memories. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.